Tonight on KQED Newsroom, the Warriors beat the Celtics in Boston, capturing their fourth NBA championship in 8 years and ushering in talk of a basketball dynasty. Plus, what happened when a group of alleged Proud Boys scared children at a Bay Area library this week. Our news panel digs into this story and other recent threats of violence against local politicians. And this week's Something Beautiful is a walk down Clarion Alley in San Francisco's Mission District. Coming to you from KQED's headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, June 17th, 2022. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Scott Schaefer, in for Priya David Clemens. Well, on Thursday, the Golden State Warriors held off the Celtics in Boston, winning their fourth NBA championship in 8 years, all of them under the leadership of Coach Steve Kerr. Here to talk about the season is Mark Willard, host of the Willard and Dibbs Show at 95.7 The Game. Mark, what a year, huh? What a season. And, you know, no one really saw this coming, and anybody who says they did is probably lying. Why was it that no one really thought the Warriors could do it this year?
Yeah, it's funny because it's almost like they were one of the top 5 or 6 favorites at the beginning of the year, but it's not like anyone really believed it. It was almost just like a respect nod for their previous accomplishments. But they've been trying to overcome so many devastating injuries. If you look at their arc over the last 3 years, the departure of a Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson with back-to-back devastating injuries, a torn ACL and a torn Achilles. Steph Curry and Draymond Green have had their own sort of smaller injuries, still bad ones, but not quite as bad. And so for 3 years running, they were never healthy as a group. And even this year, they were never really fully all there at the same time until the playoffs started. So it was almost just a leap of faith to think if they ever get back together, maybe it'll look like it used to, but you didn't know until you saw it, and then suddenly it did.
Yeah, suddenly it did. Well, it's all about peaking at the right time, isn't it? Steve Kerr said that this win, this championship, was the least likely or the most unlikely of the 4. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is just simply based on the experience and talent of the people on the roster. I mentioned Kevin Durant no longer being on the team. The teams that won in 17 and 18 just physically overwhelmed the rest of the league. They were just too good for everybody. This one, a mixture of some young players, and even the players that you knew were experienced and talented are now in their mid-30s as opposed to their late 20s. And Klay is coming off of these injuries, and so would he perform the same way? There were so many questions, and you had to blend new players together in with it. And you just never know how that sauce is going to taste, you know, until it's all mixed together.
Well, and with Curry's injury late in the regular season, too, it was like, I don't think those 3 guys, Draymond, Klay, and Steph, had really played much together until the very playoffs.
A matter of just a small handful of games. And so add that in again with the other players who are new to this, Andrew Wiggins, young players like Jordan Poole. You didn't know. I do want to also, though, give a nod through all those injuries to the way the Warriors played this. I think at times the injuries were maybe not quite as bad as we would think because they were very conservative with the way they wanted to play it.
Not Klay Thompson.
No, but even Klay probably stayed out a little longer than he had to. And even then when he did come back, he never played back-to-back games. If they played 2 nights in a row, he would only play 1. They took a very measured approach with an eye on the playoffs, and it worked.
You mentioned Andrew Wiggins, who the Warriors acquired right at the trade deadline in 2020, and he was kind of a bum. I mean, he had been a first draft pick by the Timberwolves in Minnesota. By all accounts, a disappointment. And so I guess it was a roll of the dice to acquire him, but obviously the Warriors saw something in him.
No doubt. They saw something in him, number one, and a roll of the dice, except for it's not like they had a whole lot of other options either. Like, this actually goes all the way back to when Kevin Durant left, based on some salary cap rules. He allowed the team, instead of Kevin just leaving on his own, to turn it into a sign and trade deal. That led to them acquiring D'Angelo Russell. Then they traded D'Angelo Russell to the Timberwolves to get Andrew. So they had to get somebody, and that's who was available. And he's always been very, very talented, but his reputation that he would just kind of cruise at B level. And also he was never part of a culture that was that great. The Timberwolves had never really achieved anything. So that's really the key to this whole thing for Andrew. He has the talent, and then he needed to learn about the culture from people like Steph and Clay and Draymond.
And when you say the culture, is it the winning culture? I mean, the Warriors know how to win, like the Patriots knew how to win. They almost didn't know how to lose. You know, they were so used to winning. I mean, it's got to be more than that, because he had to feel like this was a place for him to thrive.
Yeah, well, I believe that what Andrew really needed was to be in a spot where he was just accepted, and they weren't looking at him to be, okay, go lead us. And he's like, you know, that's either not in my DNA, or I don't know how to do that yet. And so he found a spot where he was very, very accepted. They put him in his best position to succeed, but also he wasn't asked to go out there and be that lead character in the show.
He's pretty shy.
Yeah, he's an understated guy. And in fact, I feel like I've seen him smile and heard him talk more in the last 3 weeks than the first 7 years of his career. So I think that role just ended up fitting really well, like so many of these other pieces that we're talking about.
Well, and it seems like it was forever ago, but at the beginning of the season, remember, he didn't want to get a vaccination.
Yeah.
And that could have been a big problem, like it was with Kyrie Irving in Brooklyn. And, you know, I'm not sure all of what went into that. I mean, ultimately, I guess the team talked to him and people he trusts, but he had some concerns about the safety of the vaccine and maybe some other things, that he was denied a religious exemption. But how important was that for him to basically do what he really didn't want to do, and get that vaccination?
I mean, I think it was huge. Obviously, the rules in New York and California, especially at that time, were very, very different, and so players were simply not going to play if they did not agree to get the vaccine. And like you said, I think there will always be mystery into exactly what was going on and who talked to who and figured it out. And in New York, Kyrie Irving never did, and it may have derailed the Brooklyn Nets season, and Andrew Wiggins finally did. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly where his head was at on this at the beginning, but in a way, I like to think of that as speaking to that culture that we're talking about, where the group sort of impressed upon him that this is something we're going to need to figure out.
And they never turned on him either.
Nope.
I mean, you know, they were really supportive.
Yeah.
So finally, after all the things Steph Curry has done for and with the Warriors, he's the MVP in the finals. What does that mean to him, but to the team?
Yeah, I think in a weird way it means more to all of us, and I mean that by fans, media, what have you. We've talked a lot about it being the only trophy that's not in his case. And so he's such a team guy. I don't think it's maybe bothered him as much as some people wanted it to bother him. But they also showed when they won, they talked a lot about all the things that people have said about them. So that does matter to them. And this takes away kind of the last thing that someone could point to that Steph has not achieved.
Yeah, and also, of course, the game 5 before last night, Curry was horrible. It was the first game in, I think, 4 years that he hadn't had a three-pointer. He was 0 for 9, I think. What impact do you think that had on him? I mean, what did he have, 34 points last night?
He did, and I think it was at least 6 three-pointers, and some of them were, you know, of the very quintessential Steph variety. So I think anybody who is as ultra-competitive as these guys are, think about the motivation it takes to be the guys who've won a bunch of rings and no one else has, and you still want to win again. If you're that ultra-competitive, it bothers you when you do that, and you want to respond. So in a way, when the Warriors won Game 5, but Steph had a bad game, I think it worked in their favor for Game 6 because you knew he was going to come out laser focused.
Yeah. So the Warriors, the core of their team, Clay, Steph, and Draymond, are getting up there.
Yep.
You know, they're in their almost mid 30s. They're still together. They're going to probably, and they've grown up together. They have kids now, some of them. What difference does it make to have the next generation, the Jonathan Kumingas, the Jordan Pooles, having played on a team like this with these guys? And we should mention also Andre Iguodala, who's such a mentor.
Absolutely. He took on a role, almost a coaching role at points this year. I think it sets them up for the potential of this being a really interesting and long run where maybe they're almost handing a baton to others. And if these guys can realize their potential physically, they've now had this emotional and mental experience of knowing how to win, and they can take that into their veteran years. Also allows Steph, Clay, and Dre in their 30s to maybe play fewer minutes and fewer games and stay healthier as they get ready for the playoffs. So it's one of those rare things where it's like they've completed the circle of doing this now without Kevin Durant, but there's also an opening for this to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the Warriors, I don't want to say they rolled the dice, but when they came to San Francisco, they left Oakland. And a lot of the guys, I think Dre, Clay, and Steph really felt part of Oakland. And Oakland obviously wanted them to stay. What impact do you think moving here to San Francisco has had on the franchise and on the players?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it does feel a little bit more like a within the Bay Area global feel now, and there are definitely still some feelings there, not only with the players but the fans. You know, I mean, you think about what has happened to Oakland here in the last handful of years. The Raiders are gone. The Warriors go across the bay. The A's are in the middle of discussing a departure as well. And so that's very, very difficult emotionally. And so Chase Center will never be Oracle in all those sort of touchy-feely kind of ways. But this did birth Chase Center into being a place that can be loud and it can be a home court advantage. And I think, you know, when stuff like this happens, it brings all Warrior fans together. So it does help move the story forward at a minimum.
So where do they go from here? I mean, we're going to, of course, we shouldn't move along too fast. We want to savor the win. But, you know, people are already talking about next year. Who are they going to sign? Who are they going to let go? I don't see any way, though, that the core three would not be with the team. So what options, what choices are now ahead for the team?
It's probably going to be a pretty quiet offseason. It's going to be a run it back kind of a feel a little bit with this group. There are a few things. Kevon Looney is an unrestricted free agent. They'll have to figure that out. And then there are guys on the one-year deals like Gary Payton II and Otto Porter Jr. We mentioned Iguodala might retire. But I largely think the Warriors will try to keep this all together and do it again. They're spending unprecedented dollars in order to do this.
Of course, the value of the club has gone up extraordinarily.
No one's feeling
since
sorry
they
for
bought
them.
it, right?
Yes, you got Chase Center. They owe it. They earn a ton going through the playoffs like this, so they're fine. But that'll be a question. You know, even for the guys, like what role does Jordan Poole want to play? Does he feel like he could have a bigger role somewhere else? These are questions, but they're probably still a year away.
We're almost out of time, but the parade is on Monday. It's such a great thing for a city, for the region, isn't it, given the pandemic? And they had some horrible seasons the last couple, at least the first one, that they were worst in the league. So this is kind of cathartic, isn't it?
Totally. I think Monday will be sort of the therapy that maybe all of us have needed when you look at not only Warrior basketball, but what coincided in our world at that time. Klay Thompson with double injuries, and Warrior basketball goes from finals every year to 2 years of being terrible. We're all going through COVID-19 at that time. To come back together to celebrate this in an outdoor and large event and all that, I think that'll feel good for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Mark Willard, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Last weekend, several men believed to be members of the far-right group Proud Boys interrupted a drag queen story hour at San Lorenzo Library in the East Bay. The men shouted slurs at the host of the event, forcing librarians to call the police. Officers eventually arrived but made no arrests. There have been multiple incidents of violence in the past week, all aimed at local elected officials. There was a bomb outside the home of San Jose Council member Dev Davis, a bomb threat against State Senator Scott Wiener, and a Millbrae council member suffered a 2-inch laceration after 2 men dropped a brick on his head. These incidents are raising concerns over the safety of politicians, security as well during the Pride events happening this month. Joining me now to discuss this and more of the week's news is KQED Managing Editor Otis Taylor Jr. and KQED reporter Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez, my colleagues. Good to have you with us. Joe, let me begin with you. You broke that story last weekend about the drag queen happy hour. We heard a little bit there in the intro of what happened, but fill us in a little bit on exactly what went down.
Yeah, sure. So, to start, Panda Dulce has been doing these drag queen happy hours for years. She's a local drag queen from San Francisco, and really what she does, she sits down with kids and reads them a book. The book she was reading was Families, about inclusive families, 2 dads, 2 moms, a single parent, raised by grandparents. And she was doing this again Saturday when singing the welcome song, actually, is what she was doing.
And we should say this kind of thing happens, these drag queen storytelling happens across the country. Right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not unique
to San Lorenzo.
Not unique to San Lorenzo, not unique to the Bay Area. This is, it actually started in San Francisco and blossomed to be in all 50 states and internationally as well.
Incredible. And we saw the pictures of those 3 or 4 men, but there were no arrests. Do you happen to know why?
So there were, at the time, there's 8 to 10 men before they dispersed. And the sheriff said that they weren't aware that hateful things were being said at the moment once they got there. This is the claim by the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. They said that they weren't aware of it, that they were only responding to a call of disturbance. But in actuality, these men were there shouting, with children directly in front of them, shouting words that I probably should not say on air.
Probably not.
At these at this local drag queen.
Yeah.
And words of hate.
Yeah. Otis, of course, this incident in San Lorenzo is not in a vacuum. We heard at the top there are a number of threats or and actual violence in some cases. Tell us what you see as the connection. What's the through point here with San Lorenzo?
Right, so I'll give you that, but I want to give you some historical context about San Lorenzo. In 2016, students of color banded together and advocated for the school board to change the mascot and name of the school's teams. They were known as the Rebels then. The mascot was known as the Rebel Guy. He was a descendant of Colonel Reb, who was modeled after a Confederate soldier. San Lorenzo High School is where white students wore blackface and they were auctioned off for ostensibly for charity, but they were auctioned off until the 60s. This was something that was done in that school, mocking black people essentially. Now, extremist behavior is on the rise in this country and particularly in California. My colleagues Alex Hall and Julie Small recently reported on a plot of two white nationalists to blow up the Democratic building in
Sacramento, I think,
Sacramento, right? The Department of Justice has a unit to investigate extremist and terroristic threats in this country. But I want to point out that, Scott, this is not happening under cloaks, under hoods, or in the cover of night. This is widely accepted by some people. It's on message boards and it's on social media.
Yeah.
If you look at social media in California, there are handles that actively promote violence, including against Scott Wiener.
Yeah, and Joe, you've been doing some reporting and digging on that as well.
Absolutely.
As it relates to San Lorenzo.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there is a national Twitter account with 1 million followers that 2 weeks prior to the incident in San Lorenzo had essentially a mega thread of drag queen celebrations with youth and other pride events with youth across the country. And we saw I want to be careful about trying to describe causality, but at the very least, we saw after that those same incidents targeted. San Lorenzo was one of them, but the other was the arrest of 31 Patriot Front members in Idaho. And so this is a pattern, and this is national.
And the fact that it's thriving in California. I mean, California is a big state. There's a lot of red counties in California. But is there something else, Otis, about California you think that's fomenting that kind of thinking and behavior?
I don't know if there's something particular that's fomenting. I think it's the idea that we have of California and the reputation that California has, and that it's presented as this progressive state, this post-racial state. But this energy has been in California since the state's inception.
Yeah, exactly. And we see it still very much so alive in Shasta County and other counties as well. Let me change gears and talk about the impending Dobbs decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, which we expect by the end of this month could very well strike down Roe v. Wade, which gave women the right to an abortion, although in reality, in California, that's not always the case in some parts of the state just because of a lack of providers. But, as California tries to make the state a sanctuary for women coming here seeking reproductive health services, what impact do you think that could have, Joe?
Sure. Governor Newsom had a special task force looking at this, looking at the influx of people. There was maybe tens of thousands of people coming annually into California before for abortion services, but now it's an expected 1.4 million. It's quite a dramatic increase, and we know that in more rural areas, there are fewer clinics where people can access these services. Low-income areas, people have much less access to these services again, and low-income areas can be areas with people of color. So there's already limited access in California for certain people, and that made it get harder. Yeah,
and Otis, the state is flush with cash right now, and they're going to be funding helping people, I think, come here. Do you see any tensions down the road, as based on what Joe just said, or anything else around this becoming a sanctuary state? We saw that same thing with immigration, right?
Sure. I definitely do. We have a presidential election in 2024, and the former president, whether he runs or not, is going to play a role in that election. And his rhetoric inspired an insurrection, as we're seeing in the House hearings. But Joe, I want to say that this is going to make California a target for more extremist behavior.
Right.
This is putting California, making this play is also saying, hey, this is where we need to make a stand.
Well, go ahead. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
And San Francisco especially is a symbol. There's something in the national imagination that San Francisco and California both mean. And when you say it, it evokes a thought, it evokes a progressivism of trying to move things in a certain political direction, and that makes it a target.
Well, and let's not forget, 40 years ago, Moscone and Milk were murdered here. As a result, there was some of the same kind of hatred that was bubbling up at the time.
Yeah, we're in the middle of Pride Month. We should not forget that one bit. And we should also note that SFPD has said that they are aware of the recent hate incidents and they are planning accordingly for SF Pride.
Gavin Newsom yesterday decided to go on to this social media platform that Donald Trump has started and said to say basically, I'm going to be a fact checker. Which will get him a lot of followers, I'm sure, but also, Otis, could generate some of this heat and anger, right, directed at him, perhaps. You think, is that a good thing politically? How does that play out?
I think, I'm not sure where Gavin Newsom stands right now. Scott, as you know, he's will be a two-term governor if he's elected in the fall. He's also looking for a national office. And he is looking to raise his profile once again, Scott. So I don't know. Gavin Newsom is the one who signed the bill that created the California Reparations Task Force. How much appetite will he have to support that if he has these counter protests on abortion rights? If we see extremist behavior, how much appetite will he have to support that, which I think will also draw a lot of extremist behavior.
Exactly. I want to ask you about Juneteenth, which is coming up. It's the first time around this week, next week, Monday, that it's a national holiday on the heels of what happened with George Floyd's murder. Give us a short, because we're sort of a little light on time, but the history of Juneteenth and why we should really pay attention to it this year.
On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. It took almost 4 years, actually 4 years, until June 19th, 1865, for the enslaved in Texas to be liberated. That's what Juneteenth means. That's why it's commemorated. But we need more than a national holiday, one more day off, to actually acknowledge the historic harm of slavery in this country.
And, what should we be thinking about? I mean, we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day. You're celebrating the man, and what he stood for. What about with Juneteenth? Like, what kind of reflections, should we be, hoping for?
We should be hoping for pushing the message of we need equity in this country. And to achieve that, this country has to acknowledge and reckon with its racist history.
And, Joe, you've been doing some reporting around the hate crimes that have been happening, mostly directed at Asian Americans, but clearly all these things are very much connected. When we think about our history and our present and the violence in the past and how it connects to what's happening now.
We're definitely seeing an increase in hate incidents, targeting groups here in this country, but also in the Bay Area. We have to acknowledge that even though we think we're in this progressive bubble here, that we need to address it head on. It is happening here. It is happening now.
Yeah. What is the appropriate response to that? We see like there were issues around police in the Pride Parade that kind of got resolved amicably. What's an appropriate reaction for a city and an area that thinks of itself as a progressive beacon?
To institute progressive thought. Police can't solve anything. They're not going to solve the issues that ail society. But I think we need to have more conversations like this, but we need to educate the public of the origins of this hate that we see. And that really, for me, goes back to slavery and how immigrants have been treated in this country for centuries.
And really importantly, we're seeing like anti-Asian hate grow in particular. We're having a lot of discussions about whether we should be funding police more, and especially in the context after all the George Floyd protests. And we're seeing two different communities asking for safety in two different ways, and there needs to be more discussions where we're reconciling what those two communities need.
Yes.
Just finally, real quickly, Otis, any plans for Juneteenth, the holiday? Don't tell me you're working.
Of course, I work on MLK Day too as well, because I can. I'm going to be going to some parties, be out in Lake, going to Berkeley, and I'm going to go to a reparations listening session.
Awesome. All right, Otis Taylor, Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez from KQED, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, we visit a beautiful alley hidden away in the Mission District of San Francisco. Notable for its rich history with the Bay Area arts community, and most recently for its colorful murals, Clarion Alley is tonight's Something Beautiful. And that's the end of our show for tonight. You can find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, or email us at knr@kqed.org. And you can reach me on social media at Scott Schaefer. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.